So, this is a little bit of a detour. We've been reading Parfit, and this is relevant. This is on a similar topic, but it's a controversial work by a South African philosopher called David Benatar. Now, this guy has made a name for himself by being controversial. He's one of the very few philosophers I know who's been profiled in the New Yorker, for example. And his book is called Better Never to Have Been: The Harms of Coming into Existence. So you can kind of see why he's controversial, because he's arguing for a position which has been called anti-natalism. That is, we shouldn't procreate. It is literally immoral to have children, is his view. Apparently he's a very private person. You never see his face, his picture anywhere. And they didn't print it when they did the New Yorker publication, and doesn't like to answer personal questions. And one of the first things the New Yorker interviewer asked was, do you have any children? And he refused to answer. He said, that would make me a hypocrite, but it wouldn't make me wrong. So it suggests to me that maybe he has had children. But one of the good anecdotes in that New Yorker interview is one of his colleagues in the University of Cape Town, I believe it is, came back to work and she was pregnant. And all of the other colleagues were congratulating her, and she goes up to David Benatar and said, "Oh, come on, David, you must be happy for me, right?" And he paused and he said, "I'm happy for you." The implication being, but I'm not happy for that poor fetus because, you're punishing it by bringing it into existence. So, what is his argument for this strange claim? Well, the reason why it sort of fits in with what we've been talking about recently is that it involves a kind of comparison between existence and non-existence. And these are always problematic. So, for example, I remember a couple of weeks back when we were talking about death, and I had you read Fred Feldman's book, or a couple of chapters from Fred Feldman's book, Confrontations with the Reaper. He puts it this way. So he presents this view where death is a deprivation to the one who dies. But he admits that there are puzzles around this view. And he says, the second puzzle about the deprivation approach is that it appears that any such comparison is incoherent. It seems to be, after all, a comparison between A, the benefits and harms that would come to a person if he were to live, and B, those that would come to him if he were to die. However, if he doesn't exist after his death, he cannot enjoy or suffer any benefits or harms after death. So there apparently is no second term for the comparison. In other words, the deprivation account says, you are harmed by your death because you would have had this good stuff that you end up not having. And as he points out, this seems like there's a problem because it's comparing what you would have got with what you get dead. And of course, you don't get anything dead because you don't exist. So there is definitely this kind of puzzle about how can we talk about comparing existence with non-existence. And when we were doing, I had you read that Parfit chapter, the non-identity problem. And Parfit was careful in that chapter to be agnostic about whether or not bringing someone into existence benefited them or didn't benefit them. And he said, well, if it benefits them, this is true, and if it doesn't benefit them, this is true. So whether or not it benefited them didn't affect his argument, but he refrained from staking a position on that topic. Although in an appendix, he argues that maybe coming into existence is a benefit. Well, Benatar is going to say, not only is coming into existence not a benefit for you, it's actually a harm for you. Why coming into existence is always a harm. That's the second chapter in his book. And famously, because, well, infamously now, because his argument has invited a lot of controversy. This is how he argues for it. So first of all, he points out that if you exist, the following two things are obviously true. That if you are in pain, that is bad for you. If you're experiencing pleasure, then that is good for you. And actually, he's not committed to hedonism. This sounds like he's a hedonist, which, if you remember, was one of the theories of value, of theories of well-being. He actually reminds us of the three major theories of well-being. This categorization of theories of well-being is owing to Parfit, which are hedonism, that is, well-being is in terms of pleasure versus pain, desire satisfaction, that is, your well-being is measured in how many of your desires are satisfied, and objective list theories, which suggest that, well-being consists of a bunch of things on these lists, which can subsume the other two, because things on that list could include pleasure, your desires being satisfied, wisdom, that kind of thing. So he actually is not committed, he doesn't want to commit to any of those. But on any of those, it's certainly true, he would say, that presence of pain is bad for you. It's not the only bad thing necessarily, unless you're a hedonist, but even then absence of pleasure can be bad for you, as Feldman pointed out. But it certainly is bad for you. Okay, so nobody disagrees with Benatar on these 2 points. If you exist, pain is bad for you and pleasure is good for you. Here is the asymmetry that is the basis of his argument. He says, if you don't exist, for somebody who doesn't exist, now notice that this is the odd thing about his claim. He is not making an objective claim about the existence of pleasure or the existence of pain. He's not saying, sort of from a God's eye point of view, the existence of pleasure, whomever has it, is good. The existence of pain, whomever has it, is bad. He is saying, for this individual X. So that makes sense in this column. For this individual X, if X exists, then the X's pain is bad for X. X's pleasure is good for X. Nobody's going to argue with that. Where it gets a little bit weird sounding is where he says if X never exists, then the absence of pain is good. Now, how does he put it this way? He says on page 30, the absence of pain is good even if that good is not enjoyed by anybody. Now, how can you say that the absence of pain is in some sense good for X if X doesn't exist? Well, here's how a not very sympathetic commentator puts it. Well, actually, the basic idea behind this is that he gets this from a philosopher called Joel Feinberg, who is an influential legal philosopher and wrote on well-being and things like that. Joel Feinberg says, we are familiar with the notion of being better off dead. That is, if someone is in extreme pain, extreme agonizing pain, we might say to them, that person would be better off dead. Let's say there's no prospects for them recovering. And that makes sense to us. Well, what you're saying, if you're saying that someone is better off dead, is that you're comparing their existence with pain and their non-existence. And you're saying the non-existence is better. So you are making a comparison. You are comparing, you are saying that non-existence is better for that person than existence. And that's what we're doing here. We're saying absence of pain is good. Why is it good? Because it's better than presence of pain. So if we have a choice between these two, this is better than this. So we can compare them. What about this one? Presence of pleasure is good here. Absence of pleasure is not bad. Not bad. And again, how does he put it? He says, this is again on page 30, the absence of pleasure is not bad unless somebody is deprived. So he says, if there is somebody who is missing out on pleasure, then that person's absence of pleasure can be bad. This is the idea of being deprived. So for example, Ben Bradley's example of the baseball tickets. So suppose you're a huge fan of the Boston Red Sox. You live right next door to the stadium. They're in the World Series. And a friend of yours comes by some tickets to the World Series game that day and wants to give them to you as a surprise, so they tuck them into your mailbox. Before you find out about this, somebody steals them. So you go to your mailbox, there's nothing there, and you think, yeah, okay. And then you go and watch the game on TV, and you kind of enjoy it. So you have an okay day. But if you'd have found the tickets, it would have been the best day ever. Let's say they win the World Series, and being there would have meant the world to you. So obviously, if you found the tickets, your day would have been much better. Your being deprived of that pleasure is bad for you. Everybody is pretty much okay with that idea. But if you don't exist, you can't be deprived of pleasure. So that's what he means by saying the absence of pleasure is not bad unless somebody is deprived. But if nobody is deprived, then it's not bad. Okay, now this is an asymmetry because you're saying the absence of pain is a positive value, is good. But you're saying the absence of pleasure is not a positive value. It's a kind of absence of a value. So there's the main asymmetry that is the core of his argument. Now, what this ends up, and if he just left it at that, most people would say it's fairly intuitive. And in fact, he backs up this intuitive asymmetry by saying that it is the best explanation for 4 other intuitive asymmetries. So for example, here's the first one is, he says, we believe that we have a duty not to have a child that would just be in pain. So for example, suppose you're considering, you're undergoing IVF, and you've made a bunch, the lab people have produced a bunch of embryos, and they've tested all the embryos, and you find out that one of the embryos has, I don't know if you can test this genetically, but let's say you can. There's a horrible condition called Hallapose-Siemens syndrome, where essentially the child that has it, their skin, when exposed to the air, when it's born, when it comes out of the amniotic fluid, just sloughs off. It won't bind. So essentially their skin is continually coming off, exposing raw flesh to the air. If you try to feed them, the roof of their mouth collapses. It's basically, they're in horrific pain for all of their short existence. If you have a mild version of it, apparently you could live as long as till the age of 12 before you succumb to skin cancer. So it's just horrible. And it actually, there's a children's hospital in Holland where a pediatric doctor was exposed to a child with this, and it motivated him to lobby for infant euthanasia, because he said this child that had this condition, he wasn't allowed to put it out of its misery because, you know, euthanasia was illegal, and he just had to watch this child just suffer. You know, even the strongest pain medicines, you could see it was in constant suffering. And of course, it died before it was a year old. So imagine that you discover that one of your embryos has this condition. It's intuitive to us that we have a duty not to have that child. if you're choosing which embryo to implant for IVF, you shouldn't choose that one. Most people would agree with that. But notice this is an asymmetry. If you knew that one of the other ones would have the best life ever, I don't know how you know this, but suppose you know this, we don't think that you have a positive duty to have that child. So we do think you have a duty not to have the terribly suffering child, but we don't think that you have a positive duty to have the child that will have pleasure. So there's an asymmetry. We do have a duty not to cause suffering, but we don't have a duty to bring into existence a child that would experience nothing but pleasure. And he says that the way to explain this is through the asymmetry that he believes exists between these two. Second asymmetry on page 34, he says, it would be a perfectly fine reason not to have a child that it will suffer. In fact, a lot of people nowadays are saying that. I think it's wrong for me to have children because the world's going to shit, right? A recession's coming, the world is polluted, there's plastics everywhere. You know, you can't drink rainwater anywhere on the planet anymore because we've so fucked up the environment. Some people say, I shouldn't have a child in this world. Or, you know, imagine it gets much worse. We're just living in a radioactive wasteland where people are, you know, their lives are constant misery until they die at a young age. I think most people would say, I have a duty not to have children. So we think it's a perfectly fine reason not to have a child, that it will suffer if we have it. But on the other hand, he says it is a strange or incoherent reason to have a child that it will benefit. That is, we don't say, should we have a child? I guess we've got to, because if we did, it would have a good life. So I guess we've got to have a child. Nobody reasons like that. They think that there is no reason that compels you to have a child. So there's another asymmetry. You have a good reason not to have a child that it will suffer, but you don't have a reason to have a child that it will have a good life. Reasons for regret. He says you can regret both of these things. Bringing a child into existence, say like the parents who had the child with Hallopos-Siemens syndrome, you can regret having that child. And you can also regret not having a child. You know, you reach the end of your life and you say, I never had children. Oh, I wish I had. So you can regret both of those, but you can only regret the first one, that is having a child, for the sake of that child. You can't regret not having a child for the sake of the child that you didn't have. You can't on your deathbed say, if only I'd had, you know, little Joey. Boy, it's bad for little Joey that I didn't parent little Joey. That doesn't make sense. So there's another asymmetry, he says. And finally, the distant land one. You know, we can. This one I don't find as compelling, but it's on page 35. Is it? Yeah, so let's look up exactly what he says. He says, distant suffering, whereas at least when we think of them, we are rightly sad for inhabitants of a foreign land whose lives are characterized by suffering. When we hear that some island is unpopulated, we are not similarly sad for the happy people who, had they existed, would have populated this island. So we're sad for actually existing unhappy people, but we're not happy for. We're not sad for people who don't exist who would have been happy. So there's nothing to be regretted there. Again, I don't find that one particularly compelling, but the other three are perfectly straightforward. So what he's done here is he's pointed out to intuitive beliefs we have. And seems to have a lot going for it, for these intuitions. Then, though, he punches us in the gut because he says, okay, you've bought into these beliefs that I think are just true. Let me show you what they imply. And what they imply is that coming into existence is always a harm. Why? Well, because we've got a choice between making X exist or not making X exist. X never exists. Which one is better for X? Well, we compare these boxes and work out which one is, which one wins. Okay, clearly, scenario B, where X never exists, is better for X on the top row. Why? Because good is better than bad. Okay, fair enough. But you might say scenario A wins it back because scenario A, where you have the presence of pleasure, is good. And the absence of pleasure is just not bad. So clearly, good is better than not bad. No, he says, good is not better than not bad. Because what not bad means is not bad comparatively. So it means not worse. So the absence of pleasure is not worse than the presence of pleasure. That means this is not better. If this is not worse than this, then this is not better than this. So there is no advantage here. So there is no advantage for scenario A here, but there is a clear advantage for scenario B over here. So when you compare them, A doesn't win anywhere, whereas B wins here. Therefore, you shouldn't, it's better for X never to exist. At this point, people say, I don't get it. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. Why isn't pleasure better than absence of pleasure? So he draws an analogy here. He says, compare two people. And this is on page, this analogy is on page 42. I think this is a good analogy for his purposes. He says, okay, S, for sick, is prone to regular bouts of illness. Fortunately for him, he is also constituted that he recovers quickly. H, another person, H stands for healthy, lacks the capacity for quick recovery. But he never gets sick. It is bad for S that he gets sick. So what you would have to say here is that this is bad. It is bad for S that he gets sick. What page were we on? 42. Yeah. So, and it is good for him that he recovers quickly. Okay. H, healthy, lacks the capacity for quick recovery, but he never gets sick. It is bad for S that he gets sick, and it is good for him that he recovers quickly. It is good that H never gets sick, so this is good. But it is not bad that he lacks the capacity to heal, because he never needs it. Now, which is it better to be? Is it better to be S or is it better to be H? And he says clearly it's better to be H. Sure, it's good for S that he recovers quickly from all of the sicknesses he's prone to, so he's never sick for long. But it's much better to be H because he never gets sick. So, and he says this is exactly analogous to here. It's not bad for H because the absence of this thing is not bad for him because he never gets sick. Now, how is that analogous to this? Well, it's exactly this. You've got exactly the same evaluations of the 4 quadrants, and you can see why the fact that the capacity for quick recovery is good isn't an advantage over the absence of the capacity for quick recovery. And so the presence of pleasure is not an advantage for that person. Now what you've got to remember here is you might think, well, look, pleasure, no pleasure. From a God's eye point of view, pleasure is better, right? If you're looking at your God, you're looking at a universe, there's pleasure in this one, and there's no pleasure in that one. Clearly, that's better. And what Benatar would say is, that's not what I'm saying. I'm asking, is it good for the individual? And he stresses that, if you're just looking in terms of pleasure, and you don't care about who it's pleasure for, you're kind of treating the individuals that have the pleasure as mere vessels. And this is a criticism for some versions of utilitarianism, that they've forgotten the human element. They're just saying we've got to get the maximum amount of pleasure, as if the pleasure itself was what was valuable. No, it's only valuable insofar as it's valuable for somebody, says Benatar. And in this respect, it seems like this is a response to Parfit, because Parfit criticizes the person-centered view in his discussion of the non-identity problem. And he says, clearly the person-centered view is incomplete. He says, in the non-identity problem, the problem is that it seems like something isn't bad unless it's bad for somebody. And he says, but that can't be true. Whereas Benatar's pushing back and saying, no, look, the only relevant comparison is this good or bad for somebody? So this is good for X. Is that an advantage over the absence of pleasure for a non-existent X? And it isn't an advantage because this person, and it isn't an advantage, and he says, and you believe that because it's the only way to explain these other asymmetries. You don't believe, so to press this again, you don't believe that the fact that your child will be happy means that you have to have that child. You don't think you're doing anything wrong in not having a child, despite the fact that, let's say, even if you knew that child would be happy. So clearly you're saying it's not bad not to have a happy child. There's no advantage. The happy child is not an advantage over the non-existent child who in some sense misses out. So you are committed to this. What that means, though, he says, is that you should never have children, because X never existing is an advantage over X existing. How much of an advantage, he doesn't say in this chapter. In the following chapter, he says, it's a very pessimistic chapter. It's totting up all of the planes that we in fact have, and in fact argues that we're not good evaluators of how much suffering there really is in our lives. And in fact, there is a lot more pain in our lives than we know, and therefore it would be very bad to bring a child into existence. There you go. The basic idea is about comparing existence to non-existence. Some people say it can't be done. He says not only can it be done, but it tells you that non-existence is preferable. Interesting argument, very controversial. A lot of people have piled on Benatar for this. A lot of people don't just disagree with him, they are very morally disapproving of him.